The PlayStation is home to many obscure and yet quite memorable action-adventure style games that would have seen great success during the lifespan of the console, with games like Tomb Raider among many others. But there were also a few games that, while not hitting the great heights of success, would be quite obscure, but also had some unique elements that made them different from their mainstream counterparts that in some respects may not have aged well but are still worth looking into, that will appeal to some, maybe not others, but they definitely will appeal to a select few. But the great thing about the PlayStation console, and even just that generation of gaming, was the experimental nature that was happening within games, as 3D games was still a new concept, and it was interesting to see the types of games that were starting to evolve and show up at that time. And one of the many games on this list that appealed to many of those unique elements was Excalibur 2555 AD, that was released in 1997 for both the PlayStation and the Windows PC. But funnily enough, unlike other types of games where PlayStation or console ports were usually from the likes of Windows games, in this case Excalibur, the Windows version, was actually a port of the PlayStation version, which in a lot of ways is very, very different. You didn't often see that back then. So this is a very unique style action adventure game that is considered to be similar to Tomb Raider in terms of its level environments and certain playable features, but it doesn't have the unique contexts and elements that Tomb Raider would have. But it is somewhat reflective in some regards, but has its own unique quirks that makes it different from its mainstream counterparts or alternatives. So the game itself does have full use of voice acting, where you interact with different types of characters or NPCs, while the main character that you play as yourself doesn't necessarily speak, but everyone else that you usually interact with does. And the game does have some unique quirks in terms of its voice acting, as some of it can be quite campy, some of it can be quite funny, some of it can be quite serious. It depends on who you interact with, but they all have an influence on how the story or the plot plays out. While the plot itself, even though it's based on both past and futuristic events, with terrorists or thieves from the future going back in time to steal the Excalibur sword, so then the character that you play as is sent through a portal into the future to try and retrieve it. So that's where the whole plot takes place of the game. So the whole interactive elements of the game with each character that you talk to does have a direct influence on various puzzles and unlockable features that you will need to acquire in the game in order to progress. While also graphically for its time, it isn't considered to be nowhere near the best looking game on the PlayStation. It's actually far from it. But the graphical style is very quirky and it is very reflective of its time. It just has a unique charm to it that you don't often see of games from that period in a lot of respects to it. And with regards to the likes of the NPCs that you interact with, some of them are quite funny, and more notably with the first level in the game. Even from my own experience, the first time I ever played this was through the very first demo magazine or demo disc that I had officially bought myself way back in June of 1997, where you were able to play through the entire first level of the game. And for the time, myself and my brothers and my mates thought it was really cool. We actually really enjoyed that demo. If anything, we probably enjoyed the demo way more than the full game itself, because one of my mates had bought the game about a year later and he did manage to finish it, but he even said he didn't enjoy it as much as the experience we had with that demo. Because I will be honest, that demo CD, we played that a ton, because there was 4 games on that demo disc. There was Excalibur 2555 AD, there was a level from Monster Trucks, and there was also a playable 2-player demo of Micro Machines V3 alongside of an early demo build of Porsche Challenge before it was finalised, because the handling physics and that were quite different. I have done a previous video on that demo disc, I'll make sure to drop a link in the description. But the game that was played the most on that demo CD was Excalibur. Myself and all the lads actually loved playing the game. We just thought it was really cool because it was the explorative elements, because we had played the likes of Resident Evil and we had played Tomb Raider, and getting to play games that had all those explorative kind of styles and being able to look for different rooms. We loved all the backtracking elements that you seen with Resident Evil, where you had to get keys to unlock doors further on, or you had to interact with puzzles, or you had to interact with somebody or something in the game in order to get further. So that was always really cool. And this level, like when you look at it even from a reflective standpoint, even by today, it is quite short. But back then we got the most out of it. Let's just put it this way, we got our money's worth. We played that demo for ages, that we would just try to explore everything that the game had to offer in that respect. Even so much so that there was one particular room in that demo where there was a boss in it, and he kind of looked like a fueled up kind of like a junkie or like a pirate kind of level that had a gun and he had like a bat, but he was impossible to kill. He was invincible. It didn't matter what you did or how good you were at the game, you could not defeat him. Even if you just kept hitting him, you could never kill him. All you could do is just avoid him. So yeah, that was fun. But regardless of that, some of the funny elements in the game, there was a merchant in the first level, and he had a British accent, and his accent was very, very funny. And if you played Resident Evil 4 with the merchant in Resident Evil 4, you would probably remember or understand that, because he had a similar type of accent, British type of accent, and it was just like, it was very kind of cheesy, but at the same time it was almost kind of like a Del Boy kind of trait, where it's like, what have you got? Oh, I've got something to sell you, and what can I get off you? That kind of way. And it was very, very funny.
Hey, you, over here. Hey, you, got any trades? I've got plenty to offer. Spells, keys, food, all for the right price. But you don't get anything for nothing, you know. I'm quite partial to a drop of grog, but I don't suppose you have any of that. What have you got?
And for me and my mates and that was always one of the highlight features of the demo. We always thought that part, when you're interacting with that particular guy in the demo, was always very, very funny. So you literally had to interact with the likes of other people in the level in order to get something, so that you could get something from him and vice versa. He was looking for like a bottle of booze, or grog as he called it. So then you had to put everything in motion in order to get it, so that you could get something off him to progress in the level. So that's what I always loved about it, was the backtracking and the explorative elements, and interacting to find things and to interact and solve puzzles and that, so that you could keep moving forward. But as the levels went on in the game, when you got to play the full game, while it is enjoyable, even I will admit there are times when the game does get quite repetitive, because it literally is the same thing over and over again. Just the levels themselves become longer and much more difficult, to a point that in some cases, because of the damage that you will take, there are certain levels that is ridiculously difficult, that you will get absolutely destroyed, and you'll have to play the entire game from the offset, unless you've actually saved the game or you've managed to use the password save, especially on the PlayStation version, where it allows you to play the game again, or the level again, from scratch. You'll be playing it quite a few times, unless you use cheats to have like infinite health or something like that, which back then you would only have ever really gotten through the use of your game magazines or cheat code magazines and so forth, or the wee booklets that you would have got with certain magazines like Games Master and so forth, that you would have had cheats then put into the game that would have allowed it to make it a wee bit easier. And for most players, that's probably how they would have actually finished it, because the game was tough. I'm not going to deny that. It is very, very tough. But I think where people would have found it to be not as enjoyable is just the repetitiveness of the gameplay, because every level is pretty much the same. If you backtrack, you interact with people, and while it is fun to a certain degree, and I do love that style, but it's just the levels get overly long, and even with the map, it's very hard sometimes, especially in later levels, to kind of know where you're going, and you will get lost. You spend more time trying to figure out where the next place is, and then sometimes you have to backtrack from one end of the level to the next in order to do a certain thing, and that's where it can get quite repetitive. And a lot of those elements are reflective in the game's reviews, because the game did get mixed to average reviews because of those type of quirks and nuances. But at the same time, people did genuinely like the quirkiness of the game. That's the funny thing about it. While it's not the best game in the system by any means, it's definitely not the best action adventure game, it's definitely not the best in what it does, there's just something about it that has a unique charm that very few games are ever able to replicate. And it's always funny, the games that are never considered to be the best are always the ones that leave a lasting impression, and this game for me is one of those games. I think it still goes down as a piece of nostalgia in terms of the PlayStation's catalogue of games. While not the best, it definitely has some really cool and fun elements in the game, and it's definitely worth the playthrough. And especially if you're a fan of the nostalgic elements of games on the PlayStation, or even if you've played those original demos that I mentioned, you'd remember that, and you would appreciate it for what it is. because again, it was never going to be groundbreaking, it was never going to be influential in terms of what was presented, but it's just a simple concept that just has a unique charm to it. And that's what I love about the PlayStation, the experimental nature behind the games. They're not perfect, but at the same time they're not entirely bad either. They're kind of in between, and they just have enough about it that will definitely leave a lasting impression, especially back then when you were young and you were growing up through that phase of early 3D games. Games like this here, like for me personally, and even for my friends and other family members and brothers and stuff, games like this here, like we knew ourselves they weren't particularly great when we compared them to other games that we had played, but it didn't matter, because for us back then it was a privilege to be able to experience all of these new games in their entirety, or even just to get to play the demos, because sometimes the demos were equally as important as the actual full games themselves. And I know myself, we got as much fun out of playing some of those demos than we did of any game that we ever played, and this was one of those games that allowed us to do that. We did have a great experience with that demo. We thought it was brilliant, and it definitely left a lasting impression. And funny enough, it does come up in topic of conversation when we do talk about games that we've played over the years, and we have actually talked about that over on our podcast channel, which I'll leave a link to in the description. And yeah, games like this here, they do hold a unique value to some people. While they're not considered to be great, the people that have played it, especially if you played it back then, it does have some sort of lasting appeal. There's just something about it that you just can't put your finger on that just really appealed to you back then. And I think again it reflected its time and reflected the whole nuance around the whole simplicity of, or the upcoming ideas the games had to offer, because again it was still very experimental for what it was trying to do. Because while it wasn't as refined in terms of controls or combat elements, the one thing it definitely did do right, which many of these games did do in my own opinion on the PlayStation back then, is they definitely got the atmosphere and tension right. And this here game had it in an abundance as well, with gloomy kind of environments, underground style levels. It was dark, it was dreary, and it was just very, very atmospheric. And these games were well able to do that. That's what I love about the PlayStation. There was just something about it that was able to capture all of those elements down to a T. And that's why these games are worth revisiting. Honestly, they are. Yes, they're not for everybody, and I get that, but I genuinely think that if you're a fan of old school nostalgic games, and especially if you're a fan of the PlayStation like I am, these games are definitely worth revisiting at some point in your life. Maybe some of these games are titles that you never got to fully finish back in the day, like most cases myself in many cases. So now would be the perfect time to get back involved with them and to try them out all over again and to just relive that nostalgia. So for that reason alone, I highly recommend that you do have a look at it, at least see what you think for yourself, if you do like these type of third person action adventure style games. And I would love to know your thoughts on Excalibur 2555 AD for the PlayStation, if you have played it yourself, and if so, how did you experience the game? First off, did you manage to buy the full game, or did you rent it out, or did you even play it on a demo like I did? And if so, what do you think of the game overall? So be sure to share it in the comments below. And if you would like to see more videos regarding other types of similar type of action adventure games like this that were also released on the PS1, then make sure to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to be updated of future videos. And if you would like to see more videos around other types of similar games that I've also covered on the channel, then be sure to check out the playlist on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.
Terrible. There's not much in there. Here, have this key.